Welcome back, everyone. I'm Mike Pavlichko, WRSU broadcast administrator and WRSU alum, Rutgers College, class of 2000. Well, we've looked back at the transition of WRSU from an AM carrier current station to FM. Now it's time to hear some memories about that time on WRSU FM Revisited. We're joined by Bob Berman, Dave Levine, Mark Greenberg, and Mark Chernoff. And once again, here's WRSU Chief Engineer from 1974, Rich Harvey.
Greetings. This is Rich Harvey, Chief Engineer of WRSU FM when we began back in, 1974. I want to talk a little bit about what the transition to FM meant for us. But let me tell you first, we collected a group of people here that were all here when we started in 74. Well, we have Mark Chernoff, Mark Greenberg, Dave Levine, and Bob Berman here, and they will all be speaking to you about their experience with the station. But let me initially say that WRSU didn't start with FM. It went on the air in 1948 as an AM carrier current station. Carrier current stations are really common at universities. They use a technology where little transmitters are placed all over the place at different dorms and buildings, and they feed the power into the electrical wiring. So it's got limited coverage. In the early 70s, that fell out of practice because FM radio developed and things started to change. But just to show you, we had some fun then. Here's a tongue-in-cheek sign-on for the AM radio station.
Good morning. This is radio station WRSU in New Brunswick, signing on for another outstanding day of broadcast. Somebody once told us that WRSU is the student-owned and operated diathermy machine of Rutgers and Douglas colleges. Operating on a carrier current transmission system of tin cans and string, our 17 transmitters are alive and sometimes well, and hiding out in various locations in and around the Douglas and Rutgers campuses, or campi, as the case may be. Our offices and studios are tucked away in a comfortable corner of the majestic Rutgers College Student Center, located at 126 College Avenue in New Brunswick. WRSU is a member of the Intercollegiate Broadcast System, the Ivy Network, and the Campbell Dorm Club. We begin our broadcast day with a summary of late news, or the morning show, or maybe even both.
So this is how we signed on back in 1973, and we were on the air all the way through the development of the FM license and putting the FM transmitter on and getting it on the air. But I got to deal with it before the rest of the station. From the timing view, once all legal work was done and we got to order equipment, that equipment arrived in the summer of 1973. And for me, it was like Christmas. All these boxes arrived, and I got to open them up, put them together. I even built some of the furniture during that period. I spent a couple of months in a little tiny transmitter building, painting it and then knocking holes in the wall to get the transmission line out. And then these are things I've never done before. I knew what to do because I toured and talked to other stations and the vendors, of course. Well, one day before the tower went up, I got a phone call, and it was the crew, and this is before cell phones. So the guy said, I need a backhoe because you have to dig the holes for the foundation. So I said, okay. And he said, well, get me a backhoe. So I go, well, where do I go get a backhoe? So he said, look in the phone book, look under equipment, order a backhoe. So I did that, and surprisingly, a backhoe was there 2 days later. No paperwork, no one asked for anything, so it was amazing. So the tower went up very quickly, and there was two guys, an older guy and a young guy, and the young guy did all the climbing. And it looked good, and I got to look at the antenna before it went up. It's a 3-segment antenna. And then that weekend, Mark Harris came down, the assistant chief engineer, and he's, as always, has really nice camera equipment. And he took some pictures, and he's looking through the viewfinder, and he says, the bottom part of the antenna is on upside down. So I took a look, and he was right. It was put in upside down. But the only way to see that is there's a little tiny metal tab. So I had to figure out how to get a hold of the crew. They came back and reversed it. Now, if we didn't notice that, the station worked okay, except it wouldn't go very far. And the reason is the pattern of the transmission would have been either pointed downward some or up some. And it's not uncommon for people to make mistakes like that. So that was, I'm glad he came out with the camera, because it would have probably stayed that way. So we started transmitting. We had some testing to do, and we had an audio signal that we used as a test signal, which had 2 songs on it. It had a couple of IDs in it. I did one, Carol Duckenfield did one, Michael Santori did the third one. But I never put in there anything that said it was a test transmission. So I know this. We were getting calls from people all the time. People would, I get a lot of people were listening to the same 2 songs. And we got a complaint. Someone called in into the newsroom and said, "Do you know your DJ keeps playing the same 2 songs?" So that went on for quite a while. We had a lot of testing to do. So finally, on the 27th of January, we did a handoff, really, between the engineers and the programming staff of the station. I brought the signal up and did the sign-on at 4:30. And then another hour or so, Mark Harris took over. And then at 6 o'clock, we finally did go on the air with an inaugural program hosted by Mark Greenberg. So let me hand this off to who wants to go next.
This is Mark Greenberg. I was the initial general manager of WRSU FM. And of course, the reminiscences of Rich bring a lot of memories back to me. I remember that period of time he was describing as being incredibly frustrating. I would drive out to the transmitter site, and I would look at that building, and I would look at that tower, and I just was so frustrated by the federal bureaucracy that we had to jump through before we were able to actually get the station up and activated. But I do remember one particular incident that Rich is referring to, where during our testing period, we got calls that we were interfering with the hearing aids of some kids that were obviously audio challenged. And the administrators wanted us to stop transmitting. And we were like, with all due respect, we're testing the station with the permission of the Federal Communications Commission, and you're just going to have to retune your hearing aids, I'm afraid to say. Anyway, so this crazy story made it into the local press. The Rutgers Targum picked it up. And I was like getting these phone calls asking me to respond to why our devilish radio station was interfering with the hearing aids of these poor children.
So, Rich, this is Dave Levine. Didn't we also, during that test period, have to stop transmitting when there was a Philadelphia football game, an Eagles game on the air on Channel 6, and had to deal with the fact that so New Brunswick was not in the primary reception area for Channel 6. We were, and still are, I guess, although it's all cable now. But it was all about Channel 7 in New York, the ABC station. But it just seemed, I have this memory of there were enough people in the region that, and 88.7 FM was close enough, I guess, you would know the technology, Rich, but to the frequency of, or the audio frequency of Channel 6, that we were actually interfering with that as well. And it was, Mark, it was enough to be, shutting down deaf kids' hearing aids. That was one thing, but to interfere with the Philadelphia Eagles football game, that was a whole nother thing. And that also occurred during the test period, right?
That's true, Dave.
Yeah, let me go over that a little bit. There was an issue at the FCC of the nearness and frequency between Channel 6 and the educational FM band, and that was being considered for limitations about the time we put the station up. So they let us go on, but we had to conduct tests to prove that there were commercial filters available for receivers for people to put on their TV sets to eliminate it. And we did that. And that was a big effort, involved dozens of student station members. And we also borrowed a color TV, I think, from Ron Hope. And I forgot where we got the black and white TV. And we went all around the area and really checked and make sure that these filters would work. So that was one issue. Another issue occurred with, I think it was a garden complex, apartment complex in North Brunswick that was somewhat near the transmitter. When you bring a new signal into the area, some amplifier devices aren't able to handle that. And so this garden apartment would actually not be able to receive any TV much while the transmitter was up. And they had to fix it. We to amplify a little bit what Dave just mentioned, Monday Night Football was really popular, so we would not do any testing during the football game.
Right.
Because we got too many calls at that point. One of the calls, by the way, was from a television technician who lived in the garden apartment, and he's been working trying to get the owners to fix it. So eventually, he was successful. Now, let me go back a little bit to the school. The school was in Piscataway, and I took the call from the teacher and explained, that we're testing and we're going to be going on the air soon. And she said, "Are you a student there?" And I said, "Yes." And then she said, "Well, stop it." And I said, "No, we have authorization from the FCC." And then she just went on to talk to someone else. She wasn't going to deal with me. The story went into the New York Times, and there's a quote in there from the teacher. And here's what she said. "It started a week ago. All of a sudden, the children were dancing around and clapping their hands. It was like they'd gone mad." So that was probably pretty shocking to them. I also know it was picked up by other newspapers. One of the station members who's from Chicago got a copy from the Chicago Tribune. The story ran. So it's like the first big publicity we got as a station.
I just want to give you all a little background on how I came to be at WRSU FM, because it's kind of a really curious story. I really don't know how extracurricular activities are promoted or advertised on campus these days, but when I was a freshman, there was like an opportunity to visit various clubs, check out the ROTC program, and explore those extracurricular opportunities. Well, I went immediately up to the radio station and decided that that was for me. I mean, I was going to commit myself to working at the radio station, and I started very briefly in the newsroom. And Rich Harvey may be able to elaborate on this a little bit more, but there were some political tugs at the time that I was a freshman and beginning my work there. And under circumstances that are still muddy to me, by the spring of my freshman year, I found myself the general manager of the radio station. I had a little bit of experience at my high school where I worked in a closed carrier system, but I certainly had no experience running a business or running a radio station or anything like that. So it was a absolutely fantastic challenge. I relished it. And as I said a little earlier, it was during that period that Rich was doing all this incredible work on getting the FM station up and running. I was so fortunate to host the inaugural broadcast of the program and found myself in the studio with Dr. Edward Blaustein, the president of Rutgers University at that time. And you have to understand that from a political point of view, Ed was a fairly reviled figure on campus at that particular time. And it had to do with a lot of different things. The anti-war sentiment on campus was very strong. There was a strong impetus to rid the campus of the ROTC program. He kind of represented the man to us at that particular point in time. So Ed comes up to the station, and in just having reviewed the tape over the course of the last couple of weeks, I came to appreciate how incredibly gracious and complimentary he was when he came up to the station to help us inaugurate the broadcasts. And at the time that it was happening, I certainly don't think I appreciated it for what was being offered at that time. So I have to slap myself on the hands a little bit and say that I probably was not as courteous to Dr. Blaustein as I probably should have been that night. And he was incredibly gracious and complimentary. So it was a fantastic night, and it was such an honor looking back on it to have him up in the studio with us and praising all of us for this enormous amount of voluntary work that we had done.
I have an anecdote about Edward J. Blaustein. In order to, I guess, maybe buy off some of the students who were very involved in complaining about the Vietnam War and what Rutgers was involved with, Rutgers rented a train from Amtrak, I guess, and a passenger train, and it went to New Brunswick. It filled up with students who went from there to Washington, D.C. to meet with congresspeople, senators, so that they could talk about their feelings about the Vietnam War. And I remember Amtrak was pretty stupid and included a bar car. And I happened to be sitting near Dr. Blaustein, who knows why, just coincidence. And I remember a young woman, a student, came over to him and said, "Fast Eddie, will you buy me a drink?" And I thought, wow, that was incredible. So that's my Dr. Edward J. Blaustein anecdote.
Well, wait a minute, Bob. Did he buy the drink or didn't he?
I don't recall.
I was actually listening to some of these recordings from back then. I didn't also realize just how he really was into this. He was amazed that we had an organization with this many people putting in this many hours. I think you mentioned it was like 15 hours on average per person.
It was a lot.
And we had about 110 staff members. But of course, there was a lot of people that put in 50, 60, 70 hours a week. And some of them couldn't get out of school because you have to go to class sometimes.
Bummer. Nah, you didn't have to.
Bummer.
But he was impressed. Anyway, and I don't know the details of this, but he started doing a show here.
I was about to say he definitely did a regular show early in the FM days. Took phone calls and it was pretty much, as I recall, an open mic. And he was Dr. Blaustein was really a big supporter of the station. I think he was kind of fascinated by it, actually.
You're right, Dave. He did do that program, and it was very unfiltered.
Totally.
Anyway, Rich, getting back to something you just said, I know from my personal experience, I have no idea what kind of hours I put in at the station, but, I ended up essentially having to leave my post as general manager in my junior year because my grades were so horrible.
Yeah, well, it's not clear what to follow up on that.
That's okay. I wasn't expecting a lot of sympathy. It's fine.
How many years did it take you to graduate?
I got out in normal time.
I graduated on time.
Okay, so it was 4 years?
Yes.
Okay, well, I wasn't sure.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I guess I should introduce myself, even though I have been talking. Dave Levine. I was the class of 1974. Started at Rutgers College, and like as Mark talked about, the amount of time spent at the radio station, which I never regret, because actually that's what gave me my career for the rest of my life. But definitely was, my priority was definitely not going to class. So I was lucky enough at the end of my freshman year to transfer to Livingston College, which at the time was an extremely liberal, no grades, everything was pass fail. And that gave me the home to both create my future in media and also to somehow manage to get a college degree out of it. I mean, to be blunt, it was the kind of thing where, you know, I like Mark. I guess I went to an orientation meeting my freshman year when it was an FM station, AM station, and totally. I mean, that became my home. I mean, like really full time, almost full time. If there was any spare time, it was at the radio station. But it also enabled me to hone my skills a lot. And actually, the other thing about that time frame was having some fantastic mentors in the radio station. I mean, I'm going to say I learned more about media, about broadcasting, and to a certain degree about life from the amount of time I spent at WRSU AM, because it was 3.5 years of AM, and really developed a lot of skills. I mean, I'm a good writer because I spent hours and hours in the newsroom, but also had some great coaches and mentors who, when I was a freshman, were probably seniors. I mean, Ed Olbaum, Bob Honig, who went on to jobs in media right from there, and my focus was always news, and was a big believer in local news, and we did an enormous amount of local news, but again, talk about my commitment. I mean, it got to the point where freshman or sophomore year, I don't know, I was doing a half-hour local newscast 5 nights a week. If you can imagine the amount of hours that went into that, but also, I mean, the product was amazing. I have in my filing cabinet a couple of scripts from those local radio shows, local newscasts that really showed the amount of effort that went in. I mean, with an entire team covering stories. Maybe of that half hour, 20 minutes of it was Rutgers news on a daily basis, really, competing with what the Targum was putting out. And I mean, it was an enormous experience. It was a great experience that, I mean, interestingly, we're talking about the sign-on show. At the time of the FM sign-on show, in the beginning, I was in my car driving to the Rutgers Student Center because I had just finished a news shift at the local radio station in New Brunswick, WCTC, and had been doing that for a couple of years. So, it developed a lot of skills, a lot of knowledge, and totally, attribute my career, which I will say has been pretty successful in media, to my participation at WRSU AM first and then FM. And had an enormous amount of fun and made incredible friendships.
What did you do after college?
Well, that's an interesting question. I mean, I almost immediately got hired by Rutgers within a couple of months of college in the public relations department. Was working there, and then ended up very quickly heading up the radio and TV office, which was, and maybe still is for all I know, in an old barracks on the Livingston campus, and was there probably till I'm going to say 6 or 7 years, until I moved on to another gig, which was also kind of fun because it was essentially a satellite TV station for hospitals. And I got recruited, based on what I was doing at Rutgers, and which was basically educational television. So I mean, but the other thing, Mike, which is interesting and maybe isn't a story that's well known, is I'm the reason that your job exists. The broadcast administrator was not something that existed at Rutgers, and I was working in the public relations department. So, and frankly, anything that came up around broadcast or media somehow, ended up on my desk. And there was a complaint that had come in about somebody, no names. I don't even think I can remember the names, but somebody who had been told he could not do one of the specialty radio shows, mostly because he was not a student. Maybe he had dropped out. Or there was somebody else. I don't really remember, but basically the question came up, well, who's responsible for this? Who do we talk to? And my answer was, well, the license for this radio station is with the Board of Governors of Rutgers University. But frankly, Rutgers University has very little to do with the day-to-day administration or management. And that probably wouldn't pass muster with the FCC. I mean, because there was absolutely no responsibility. And this is, I'm sure, Mark, after you had already left or gone back to class. And I said, you really have to have an employee who is ultimately responsible for this. And took it to Dean Howard Crosby, who was the dean of students of Rutgers College, who I think had gotten the original complaint, and said, you got to do something about this. And they were like, well, who's going to pay for it? And I said, you're going to pay for it. I mean, this requires somebody who is essentially legally and administratively responsible for the station, even though it's entirely run by volunteer students. And that resulted pretty quickly in the hiring of a broadcast administrator. Maybe your predecessor, Mike. I'm not sure. His name is escaping me at the moment.
Tim Esbar.
Yeah, you know what? I think it was Tim Esbar.
Yeah.
Yep. And that kind of became one of the key foundations to the ongoing existence of WRSU FM. Tons of students, all volunteering, lots of community participation, which I know we want to talk about, Rich, but also one professional who was ultimately and legally responsible to maintain and the rules of that FCC license. So I was talking about my career and, the fact that, started actually on staff at Rutgers right after graduating, stayed until I guess around the early 80s, helped launch a satellite television education system and network for hospitals nationally. And that was based out of Princeton. That lasted until our only competitor bought us out and fired us all. But that was a great thing, because then I basically started my own video production company, and that went for about 25 years, working primarily in the medical arena, because that was where my experience was with that satellite television network. And then, fast forward a little bit. I'm currently chief product officer for a medical publishing company, which basically makes me accountable for all of our web and digital programs. And so, podcasts, videos, all again focused on educating doctors. And been at that now for 19 years, and thinking of retiring, but not sure what I would want to do if I did. So I'm still there. So Mark, what? I remember you going off to MTV, right?
Yes.
And then we lost track. Maybe you want to talk about what your career was.
Yeah, sure. After leaving Rutgers, I was fairly aimless for a couple of years, trying to find my way through life. And I finally hooked up with a international management consulting firm out of the city, where I was doing some research work for them. Didn't find it particularly satisfying. So I started hitting the streets again. And I happened to see in the New York Times one Sunday that there was a large facility in Piscataway, New Jersey, I think for engineering applications, for a new company that was a joint venture between Warner Communications and American Express that was getting into the satellite programming business. And I thought, man, not the only exposure I had to cable at that particular time was there was like a kind of a junior MSG network that cable cast home ranger games. That was a really big deal. But I just thought that the notion of going to work for a combination of those companies would be a pretty intriguing situation. Somehow or another, I got hired by these people. It was just a stroke of blind luck. And I ended up doing a bunch of marketing work for them, moved to Atlanta for a year, and then came back to New York City to start working on music television. And it was a very exciting time. It actually reminded me a great deal of my experience at WRSU FM, because everybody working there was kind of my age. We were all very close friends. We were working just ridiculous numbers of hours. Anyway, I ended up becoming the first national director of marketing for the channel, where I developed the I Want My MTV advertising campaign and was responsible for its deployment in various media markets across the country. It's hard to imagine looking back on it now, but the whole venture was quite the crapshoot. I had a very, very limited budget, and so we decided, rather than advertising in kind of a very traditional way, that we would force our distributors to carry the channel by creating demand among its consumers. So that's where the I Want My MTV thing came from. And I stayed there for a couple of years and then got a wonderful opportunity to work for a cable company. In other words, the distribution side of the business here in Austin, Texas. And I stayed there for 25 years. Kind of went into semi-retirement for a little while, but I'm in the process right now of starting a new company, which is an AI SaaS platform in the podcasting vertical. So what we're doing is we're chopping up podcasts into 25 to 30 second promotional clips, like coming attractions. And we're probably a couple of months from being able to launch commercially.
We're going to talk a little bit later about podcasting and as part of the future of radio, but it's interesting that you're back in a very much radio-related type occupation there. Interesting.
Agree.
Interesting. But, as we're going around the table, we should also just talk about, I'll call it personal things, married, divorced, kids, grandchildren. Dave, we'll start with you.
So from a personal perspective, in terms of life and career, married, divorced, married, no kids, 6 grandkids, which really is a lot of fun. As I mentioned, living in Asheville, North Carolina, which I love and have been for about 3.5-4 years. Prior to that, Florida. Prior to that, long time in New Jersey. So that's kind of me from a personal perspective.
Mark Greenberg.
Yeah, I am married. Have been for 39 years. I have 4 adult male children who are doing a variety of different things, but my oldest son has kind of followed in my footsteps to some extent. He's he owns his own talent agency in Los Angeles, so he's kind of gotten into the entertainment business. My 2 other sons are in financial affairs of one sort or another, and my youngest is studying right now to take the MCATs in a couple of months and aspires to be a doctor.
That sounds great. Any of them married?
No, none of them are married. So the grandkids situation seems rather distant to me at this point in time, but I'm totally comfortable with that. I mean, they need to just follow their own drum.
Okay. Mark Chernoff, the man who took over radio. Let's look at you and WRSU and what you ended up doing.
Well, I joined RSU right away as a freshman. Worked when I started out in the sports department and also the news department, but wanted to be a disc jockey. Bob Thomas was the program director, and we called him the old man back in 1970. He was probably 28, and we were all, 18, 19 years old. But he finally allowed me to go on the air as a jock, and I remember doing a show in the middle of the night with a guy named Sam Bonner. And I never knew what happened to Sam, but he quit about 2 weeks later. So there I was doing solo shows. And I think I spent, during my 4 years at Rutgers, more time at WRSU than I did in classes. I was the one who always was around the radio station. So if someone didn't show up for a show, oh, yeah, let's go, Mark Chernoff, you do a show. I remember there was a guy named Ron Landry who did an early morning show. I don't know why. He was not a guy who slept late. And half the time he didn't show up, I got to do the morning show. Eventually got some regular shifts, which was great. Did play-by-play for Rutgers Sports at the Barn and also on the road. I remember, I don't know if anybody remembers a young lady named Pam Fessler. Pam eventually, she worked at Douglas. She went to work for NPR for many years, and we dated for a short while. And she drove out with me to Bucknell once because I had to do a play-by-play, and I had to set the whole thing up by myself. And she promised to stay awake, and she slept the whole way out and the whole way back. But anyway, I had a lot of fun at RSU. I cared a whole lot about the radio station. With my friend Lonnie Strum, who was the business manager at the station for a while, we were the ones that put together the budget for WRSU FM. And we presented the budget to the Rutgers Council, and they approved, and Rich Harvey, you probably remember, they approved everything on the budget except one thing we really needed, which was a vacuum cleaner.
Yeah, I do remember that.
The vacuum cleaner for some very strange reason. And another quick story, Rich, I mentioned it yesterday. I stopped by the radio station in the summer of '73 before my senior year, and you were doing some testing with the radio station. And you said, oh, well, since you're a voice on the radio station, we're going to sign on for a little while. Would you do a station ID? And I said, sure. And he said, you want to just pick a song and we'll play a song. And I picked Roundabout by Yes. And I just remember saying WRSU FM New Brunswick, which was just really exciting.
And hang on, with that, I think you get the award for playing the first song. We've been thinking this through. I have a little list here on my test cartridge. Had Neil Young's Saturn Man and Julie Collins' Nightingale 2. When we signed on, I played The Alma Mater by the Glee Club, and then Get Together by Youngbloods. And then Mark Greenberg played A Bridge Over Troubled Water by Simon and Garfunkel. And then Charlie Hutler, when he did the first show, did Sweet Judy Blue Eyes by CSN. But I think you did the very first song.
There you go. Months before we actually signed on as a real radio station. And I remember all the jokes we used to make about the transmitter site, where there was that great billboard that said, I think it said Modest because, or just because.
That was Modest because, you got it.
And we had to send all those pictures into the FCC. And it was like, oh, God, what are they going to really think when they see this? But look, Rich, you and your group did just a tremendous job. And Mark Greenberg, you actually gave me the title of assistant station manager, maybe just because I was a veteran and had been around and served on radio council. But, between the radio station and intramural sports, I think classes came third. But I actually did graduate with an AB degree in political science. I went to grad school at Rutgers and got an MBA a couple of years later. But I worked for an accounting firm, and I really hated it. I just really wanted to be in radio. That's what I wanted to do. And I got a part-time job up in Sussex County at WNNJ, a little 1,000-watt daytime AM radio station. We also had an FM station at 103.7. WNNJ was 1360 AM. And the FM was one of those beautiful music radio stations. And it was horrible. They did do some kind of jazz late at night for a couple of hours. But we were going to flip the radio station to country in 1977. And I was finishing up grad school. The station had offered me a job to do mornings on the AM station for like $160 a week. But I said, I got this MBA. I got to go work for this accounting firm. I didn't last there 3 months. I just hated every minute of it. So I went back to NNJ. They offered me a full-time job on the FM station to play country music starting in January of 77, which I did. Not that I loved country music, but did it. And it happens at small radio stations. If you're around for a year or two, you do wind up becoming the program director. So a guy named Michael Hendrickson left. It's Jeff Weber, who's the guy who hired me, had already left to go to Lafayette, Indiana. Michael went to York, Pennsylvania. So I was next. I remember Rick Thomas, the general manager, said to me, "Why do you want to be program director?" I said, "I love radio." He says, "Kid, you're never going to make it in radio." I said, "Okay, no problem." I met my wife, Sally, at the radio station. She was working part-time. She eventually became the news director at the radio station. I was the program director. I ran into Bob Thomas, my program director at WRSU when I started, at a Cumberland Farms down on Route 206. One day when I was heading up towards Newton, and he says, "Hey, what are you doing?" And I said, WNNJ and radio. He said, "I'm over at WDHA here at Dover. I could use some part-timers." I said, "Oh, great." So he hired me to do part-time at DHA. My first shift was on a Sunday afternoon when I was replacing the polka party. So Bob hung around and took all the 1,000 phone calls that came in, thank goodness, so I didn't get screamed and yelled at. But I wound up, Bob left about a year and a half later. He had hired me to become full-time when his wife, Mary, went to New York to go to WKTU, which wasn't disco at the time. It was, I guess it was more like an AC radio station. But then she wound up moving around. But Bob hired me to be full-time. One day, Bob decided he wanted out. He left. I became the program director. And I did mornings at DHA and was at DHA for about 7.5 years. I entered a contest that was done by Active Industry Research for program and music directors at radio stations on album rock formats. I won the contest of having to pick songs, and that brought my name to Charlie Kendall's attention. Charlie was the program director at WNEW FM. I applied for the music director job, which I eventually got. Charlie didn't get along with management, so about a year later, I became the program director. I'm proud to say we had the highest ratings ever in the station's history. I got a Billboard Program Director of the Year award. A year or two later, the company changed ownership. I wound up over at K-Rock and was Howard Stern's boss for a number of years. At NEW, I was still on the air. I probably did about 100 shifts a year. What everybody loved about me doing shifts is they knew I didn't want to be on full-time. And they were always worried because a lot of the people that I hired, the part-time people, the Pat St. John's, Dennis Elsa's, people like that, they were always afraid that they were going to take one of the full-timers' jobs. So, no, let Chernoff fill in. So I did that. Became dear friends with Scott Muni, who became a real mentor, as did Charlie Kendall for me as a PD. And then Mel Karmazin, who was running Infinity Broadcasting. This is when I was over at K-Rock after NEW had changed ownership, and they relieved most of the management, even though we had great ratings for no reason, just they wanted to bring in their own people. I wound up over at K-Rock, and as I said, was Howard's boss, and we did classic rock. Had a great time there. I hired Flo and Eddie, the Turtles, to do Afternoon Drive, which was quite creative. Mel I remember at a manager's meeting said, hey, congrats to Chernoff. He really hired some creative people, except they suck. Oh, well, that was Mel. So I was at K-Rock until 1993 when I moved over to FAN, same company. We were still Infinity Broadcasting. Mel had suggested that maybe it's a good idea to do sports. Joel Hollander had tried to get me to come over to FAN, but I was happy doing music and programming music. But I moved over to FAN and stayed there for almost 29 years. And obviously got to work with Imus for many years, Mike and the Mad Dog. Later on, hired Boomer Esiason and Craig Carton. Put them together to do mornings. When Craig, unfortunately, was incarcerated, I moved Greg Giannotti over to mornings, and it's Boomer and Geo, and they're thriving today. And I love being at the radio station. I had many side projects for the company. I was the format captain for all of the sports stations in the company. They also had me doing, some of the album rock stations, classic rock stations, working with them through the years. But I got to participate in putting our sports stations on in Boston, Pittsburgh, Atlanta, Cleveland, and I loved what I was doing. And then COVID came along, and as I was, getting up there a little bit, I said, I love being here. I love doing management. The company was getting much more into the gambling world, and it seemed like a good time to maybe, wrap things up at FAN, which I did a couple of years ago. But, deciding whether I wanted to go to Whole Foods or ShopRite or CVS was not particularly exhilarating. So I reached out to a guy named Robbie Bridges, who's the program director of Boss 107.1 down on the Jersey Shore. I had done a shift at CBS FM just before I left. We had become Odyssey at that point, CBS, Infinity, CBS, Entercom, and Entercom changed its name to Odyssey. And I did a show at CBS FM. Robbie had actually heard it, and I got a good endorsement from Scott Shannon, who I was friends with because he was in the building and we'd talk radio pretty much every day. He hired me. I've been doing part-time there. And interestingly, Odyssey has a classic hit station down in Washington, D.C. And one of my kids lives down there with grandkids, and we go down a lot. And as the format captain, this guy, Chris Kynard, is the PD down there. We got to chatting. And I said, I'm doing some shifts. He said, yeah, I know that. He said, I also run the classic hit station. Can you do some shifts for me down here? So usually twice a month on Saturdays, I'm in Washington, D.C., and I go in live and do shifts for him. I do sports reports on the morning show on The Boss here in Jersey. Those I just email in. I go in live to do all the music shows. I do some talent consulting, and I do some work. Jason Barrett, who runs something called Barrett Sports Marketing Company, I do some projects for him where I listen to radio stations, send back reports, sometimes talk to the radio station themselves and give them feedback. I've done some consulting for talent for the Buffalo Bills team in football. So I'm trying to keep active. I get calls a lot from program directors still, and enjoy working on the family end. My wife and I have been married almost 46 years. Our anniversary is in a couple of days. She had been married, had a couple of kids, but they're like my kids. And we also have 2 boys. So we have 10 grandchildren all over the place. My youngest son, Mike, or our youngest son, Mike, is the general manager for the Cleveland Guardians baseball team. So we go out there a lot, and we go to spring training in Arizona when the team's out there. And, keep busy. We love seeing the grandkids. My wife was a teacher for many years, retired a few years back. She's more comfortable doing projects at home, but we do keep busy, and we love seeing the grandkids. I love doing these air shifts. I always loved talking up to records and still do. I mean, I've been doing it in the car for 46 years, and my wife still looks at me and says, "Why do you have to talk up the post to every song we listen to?" But that was one of the things I loved doing. Tom Mangelli and I would used to go when we were still on the AM station. We would go into the record library in the back, and we would just put random records on side one, cut one. And the idea would be to talk up to the intro of the song, not knowing what the song was most of the time. And we did that. I'm still not quite sure why, but we both got a charge out of doing that. I eventually did hire Tom at DHA for a while, and then he went on to work at Shadow Traffic. I kind of lost touch with him, but he was really my first real contact outside of like Bob and the management people. And we hung around a lot freshman year. And I loved, as I said, going back to RSU. At one point, I got to run a news shift one night a week. I still did sports. I did the play-by-play, and I've just had a lot of fun. Family, radio. I have lots of good things. Hey, Dave, as long as this was a compliment, but because you were in news, I think we called you, or somebody called you Dave Bulletin Levine, because you were always hot on getting the top news stories. Do you remember that?
Very possibly, yeah. Well, I mean, I know for sure. I was just, my commitment was the news, I mean, by the time WRSU FM launched, as I had mentioned, when the actual sign on, I was on a car heading over from probably from WCTC, which was downtown New Brunswick. But I get, I mean, during, I'm going to say, my junior year of college, starting then, I mean, there was a long period of time. They talk about never going to school because, I mean, in addition to all the time I put into WRSU, I would shut down the newsroom at WCTC at I guess 1 a.m. was probably the last local newscast on a Friday night. And then Saturday morning at 6 a.m. open the newsroom at WBRW, which was an AM station coming out of Somerville. I don't think it exists anymore. But yeah, I mean, it was that was my passion. So yeah, I don't remember if they actually called me that, but yeah, I was always like, can't wait to do the next bulletin. I mean, one of my most exciting things, and this was on WCTC, was announcing the resignation of Richard Nixon. Wow. And it was, I remember that we were broadcasting live from the Middlesex County Fair, but I was in the newsroom and I got the bulletin off of the AP wire machine and interrupted the broadcast from the live broadcast from the county fair to go, Richard Nixon has resigned. So wow. One of the highlights of my career in news.
And Mark Greenberg, if I remember, you became the station manager while you were still a freshman. Am I correct on that?
That's correct, Mark. Absolutely right.
And I remember a big debate in the radio council. I was, on the radio council probably most of my time there. And are we really going to put a freshman in charge of the station? And I don't remember the politics, Mark, but definitely you were the leading candidate because there was a bit of a coup going on with some of the older previous administrators.
I think that's my recollection too, Mark. I mean, I think I was the compromise, non-controversial candidate.
Well, it was it was really a great decision. And it was good for the radio station. I think you worked very hard and you kind of got it right away. So I think that was really a smart decision that was made. But yeah, things were changing. Nat Showhalter, I believe, was either retiring or leaving, and Roger Cohen became, our main contact at that point on Radio Council towards the end, if I'm not mistaken. And trying to think what else from those days. Yeah,
I have to tell, I'm compelled. I have to tell you guys a crazy Nat Showalter story. I was about 10 years old and was living in an apartment complex in Franklin Township. And one of our good friends was like a physical education professor at Rutgers named Muska Mawston. And he had a show on a weekend show on WCBS TV in New York that was an exercise show for kids called Shape Up. Anyway, I would go on the show periodically because I was friends with the family. And one day I'm off from school and I'm waiting for Nat to pick me up and take me into WCBS TV for the show. And I was delighted because, of course, I was off from school that day. Anyway, it turns out that day that Nat was picking me up was November 22nd, 1963. And we drove into New York City with the radio on the entire time, listening about the assassination of JFK. I mean, the moment is just seared into my memory. And it's just such a small world that Nat would have ended up being my faculty advisor when I was at the radio station.
Wow.
That is. Oh, one story I did forget to tell is we used to have a show, if you remember, some of you would remember, the Soul Patrol. And
yeah, we were talking about that earlier.
Yeah, Jimmy Seymour hosted it. And it was like from 5 to 7. And the only place back in those days on the AM you could hear it was pretty much, I mean, the dorms, hardly anybody listened, but it was on in the dining hall. And I remember Jimmy saying to me, "You're the only white guy here who I will let fill in for me." So I loved filling in for him, and I just still love soul music. And I was proud to say that I was able to host the Soul Patrol a number of times.
Mike Pavlichko back again here. We're going to take a quick break. When we come back on the other side, we'll continue with more memories on WRSU Revisited after this.